Little girl calls 911 and says, "I can't close my legs." What doctors reveal leaves. Everyone in tears. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning sun had barely risen over the horizon when the call came through to the 911 dispatch center in Oak Ridge, Ohio. Jennifer Wilson was just settling into her shift, coffee cup warming her hands against the autumn chill that seeped through the building's old windows. 20 years on the job, and she still felt that flutter in her stomach when the line lit up. 911, what's your emergency? Jennifer's voice was calm, practiced, the same tone she'd used thousands of times before. At first, there was only silence, then shallow breathing. Jennifer leaned forward in her chair, pressing the headset closer to her ear. "Hello? This is 911. Do you need help?" A small voice finally came through, fragile as glass. "There's ants in my bed and nobody's home." Jennifer's training kicked in immediately, though her heart tightened in her chest. A child. Alone. "Hi there, sweetheart. My name's Jennifer. Can you tell me your name?" "Ellie," the tiny voice whispered. In the totty background, Jennifer could hear cartoons playing softly on a television, the hollow sound of wind rattling loose window panes. "Ellie, that's a beautiful name. How old are you, Ellie?" 6. The word was followed by a small whimper. "My legs hurt real bad. I can't close them." Jennifer's fingers flew across her keyboard, signaling for a trace on the call while keeping her voice steady. "I'm sorry your legs hurt, Ellie. Can you tell me where your mom or dad is right now?" "Mommy had to go. She said don't open the door for nobody." There was rustling on the line, then a sharp intake of breath. "It hurts when I move." "You're being so brave, Ellie. I'm going to send some nice people to help you, okay? They wear uniforms and it's safe to let them in." Jennifer glanced at her screen as the address came through. "Can you tell me what your house looks like? Is it a big house or a little house?" "It's little. It's blue, but the paint is coming off. There's a broken flower pot by the steps." As Jennifer relayed the information to the responding units, she kept Ellie talking. The girl's voice grew fainter, her sentences shorter. The cartoons in the background provided an eerily cheerful soundtrack to the unfolding emergency. "Ellie, can you go to the front door when my friends arrive? You'll hear sirens." "I can't get up," Ellie whispered. "My legs won't work right." The clock on the wall ticked loudly as Jennifer waited for updates from the officers en route. She asked about Ellie's favorite cartoons, her stuffed animals, anything to keep the connection. "I have a bunny," Ellie said. "His name is Hoppy. He's missing an ear." "That's a perfect name for a bunny," Jennifer replied, hearing the distant wail of sirens through the phone. "Ellie, I think my friends almost there. Can you hear them?" "Yes." The word was barely audible. "Will they make the hurting stop?" "They're going to help you, sweetheart. They're very good at helping kids feel better." "There's someone knocking," Ellie whispered. Jennifer heard muffled voices through the line, then the distinctive radio static of first responders. A man's voice came through, gentle but urgent. "We've got her, dispatch." The call ended, but Jennifer sat motionless, staring at her screen. 20 years on the job, and some calls still hollowed her out. She wondered what those responders had found. Beyond that door, what conditions had left a 6-year-old alone and in pain? As the morning sun climbed higher in the autumn sky, Jennifer Wilson reached for her lukewarm coffee, said a quiet prayer for little Ellie, and prepared herself for the next call. The day had only just begun. Paramedic. David Thompson approached the small blue house with caution. After 15 years on the job, he'd developed a sixth sense for trouble. This modest home with its peeling paint and overgrown yard sent warning signals through his experienced mind. Dispatch said it's a 6-year-old girl, home alone. "Can't move her legs," his partner Sophie remarked, medical bag in hand. David nodded, adjusting his uniform as they reached the crooked front steps. A broken flower pot lay on its side, dry soil spilled across weathered wood. The curtains were drawn, but he could hear the tinny sound of a television. through the thin walls. "Police should be here any minute," Sophie said, checking her watch. "We don't have minutes," David replied, knocking firmly on the door. "Hello? Emergency services." No answer came, but the TV volume lowered slightly. He knocked again, leaning closer to the door. "Ellie, my name is David. I'm a paramedic. The nice lady from 911 sent us to help you." A small voice came from inside, strained with effort. "I can't open the door." David exchanged glances with Sophie. "Ellie, is the door locked? Can you tell us where the key is?" "Under the turtle," came the faint reply. David quickly spotted the small stone turtle nestled beside a withered plant. Beneath it lay a tarnished key. His hands worked quickly, unlocking the door with a heavy click. The smell hit him first, mustiness mixed with something sour. David stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the dim light. The living room was cluttered but not filthy, a home struggling to maintain order rather than one abandoned to chaos. Dishes were stacked in the small kitchen sink, mail piled high on a coffee table. A half-empty glass of water sat beside an open bottle of children's fever reducer. "Ellie," he called. Softly. "In here," the small voice responded from down a short hallway. David found her in a small bedroom, lying on rumpled sheets. A stuffed rabbit missing one ear was clutched tightly against her chest. The 6-year-old's face was flushed with fever, her blonde hair tangled around her shoulders. When she saw David, her eyes widened with a mixture of fear and relief. "Hey there," he said, keeping his voice light despite the concern tightening his chest. "I'm David. This is my friend Sophie. We're here to help you feel better." Sophie moved past him, her trained eyes already assessing the situation. She knelt beside the bed, speaking softly as she took Ellie's temperature and checked her vitals. As David surveyed the room, memories from his own childhood flickered unbidden. The shame of empty cupboards, of wearing the same clothes too many days in a row. He pushed them away, focusing on the present. "Where's your mom, Ellie?" he asked gently, noticing a framed photo of a young woman holding a toddler. "Working," Ellie whispered. "She said she'd be back for lunch, but my legs started hurting really bad." David nodded, noting the time, nearly noon. He spotted medication. Bottles on the nightstand, carefully arranged in a neat row. Not the sign of complete neglect that initial reports suggested. "Can you tell me where it hurts?" Sophie asked, her hands gentle as she examined the child. "Everywhere," Ellie whispered, "but mostly my legs, and I'm really hot." David watched as Sophie's expression shifted subtly, the slight narrowing of her eyes that signaled concern beyond the obvious. "We're going to take you to a place where doctors can help you feel better," David explained, trying to mask his worry with a reassuring smile. "Would you like to bring Hoppy with you?" Ellie nodded, clutching the worn rabbit tighter. "How did you know his name?" "Just a lucky guess," David replied with a wink, helping Sophie prepare for transport. "One-eared rabbits are almost always named Hoppy. It's like a rule." The ghost of a smile crossed Ellie's face before pain shadowed her features again. As they carefully moved her to the stretcher, David couldn't help but wonder, where was this child's mother? And what would they find when she finally appeared? Memorial Hospital's emergency entrance slid open as David and Sophie wheeled Ellie through. The bright, fluorescent lights made the child squint after the dimness of the ambulance. She still clutched Hoppy, her one-eared companion, against her chest like a shield. 6-year-old female, fever of 103.2, severe pain in lower extremities, possible infection, David reported to the waiting trauma team. Found alone at home, mother's whereabouts unknown. Dr. Rachel Chen, the attending physician, nodded briskly. "Bay 3 is ready. Let's move." As they transferred Ellie to the hospital bed, Nurse Margaret Simmons approached with a gentle smile that softened her weathered face. At 65, Margaret was just 2 weeks from retirement after 40 years of nursing, but her movements remained precise and efficient as she connected monitors and prepared for the doctor's examination. "Hello, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice warm as she tucked a blanket around Ellie. "My name's Margaret. I'm going to help Dr. Chen figure out why you're feeling so poorly. Ellie's eyes darted nervously around the bustling emergency room, tears welling up. Is my mom here yet? Margaret exchanged glances with Dr. Chen. Not yet, honey, but we've let the police know where you are. They'll help your mom find you. As the medical team worked, Margaret noticed something unusual. When Dr. Chen prepared to draw blood, Ellie didn't flinch or cry like most children. Instead, she extended her arm with practiced patience, turning her face away, but remaining still. You're very brave with needles, Margaret commented, holding Ellie's other hand. Mommy says I'm her brave girl, Ellie whispered. She hates needles more than me. Margaret's experienced eyes caught other details. Calluses on Ellie's small fingers that spoke of responsibilities beyond her years, the way she responded to medical terms with unexpected familiarity. This wasn't just a neglected child. This was a child who had seen hospitals before. While Dr. Chen ordered tests, Margaret brought a cup of apple juice and some crayons. Would you like to draw a picture while we wait for the doctor to come back? Ellie nodded, taking the crayons with obvious delight. As she drew, Margaret noticed how the child's shoulders relaxed slightly, though pain still tightened her features. That's a beautiful drawing, Margaret said, watching colorful shapes emerge on the paper. What are you making? This is Hoppy, Ellie explained, pointing to a brown blob with one long ear. And this is my mom. She drew a tall figure with long hair. Beside the woman, Ellie carefully drew what looked like a syringe with remarkable detail for a 6-year-old. What's this? Margaret asked, pointing to the syringe. That's for Mommy's medicine, Ellie replied matter-of-factly. Sometimes her hands shake too much, so I help her count. Margaret felt a chill run through her. She caught Dr. Chen's eye across the room, signaling her over to see the drawing. Dr. Chen studied the picture, then knelt beside Ellie. Your mom takes medicine at home with needles like this? Ellie nodded. Not every day, just when her special medicine runs out. She says it's expensive. Dr. Chen and Margaret stepped away from the bed, speaking in hushed tones. The blood work shows severe infection and inflammation, Dr. Chen murmured. But there's something else going on here. This doesn't fit the typical neglect scenario. Margaret glanced back at Ellie, who was now adding careful details to her drawing. I've seen a lot of difficult home situations in 40 years, Doctor. Children from neglectful homes don't typically know how to draw medical equipment with such precision. Child Protective Services is already on their way, Dr. Chen replied. We need to find this mother. As they spoke, a commotion erupted at the emergency room entrance, raised voices, the firm tone of hospital security. Margaret turned to see a young woman arguing desperately with the front desk staff, her fast food uniform wrinkled and stained, her face etched with panic. Ma'am, calm down, the receptionist was saying. We can't give out patient information without— My daughter! The woman cried, voice breaking. Ellie Thompson, the police! Said she was brought here. Margaret looked from the distraught mother to Ellie, who had perked up at the sound of the familiar voice. In that moment, watching hope bloom on the child's face, Margaret felt the first tremor of doubt about the story they'd all been so quick to believe. While Ellie rested under Margaret's watchful eye, Officer Mark Jackson arrived at Memorial Hospital to investigate the circumstances surrounding the child's condition. A 20-year veteran of the Oak Ridge Police Department, Mark had seen his share of difficult cases involving children, but he always approached each one with fresh determination. The mother's here, Dr. Chen informed him, nodding toward the waiting area where Karen Thompson sat hunched forward, hands clasped tightly between her knees. Security is keeping her there until you've had a chance to assess the situation. Has she given any explanation? Mark asked, notebook in hand. Nothing coherent. She's agitated, demanding to see her daughter. Mark nodded, his expression carefully neutral. I'll speak with her after I get a full update on the child's condition. As Dr. Chen briefed the officer, Margaret quietly tended to Ellie, combing the tangles from her blonde hair with gentle strokes. The child's fever had begun to respond to medication, but the pain in her legs persisted. "Your hair is going to look so pretty when I'm finished," Margaret said, working through a particularly stubborn knot. "Mommy usually does it, but sometimes her hands hurt too much," Ellie replied. Hoppy still clutched against her chest. "Is she in trouble? I heard the loud policeman talking." Margaret chose her words carefully. "Everyone just wants to make sure you're taken care of, sweetheart. Your mom is here, and I'm sure you'll see her soon." Outside Ellie's room, a small crowd had gathered. A woman with a press badge from the local news station was interviewing one of Ellie's neighbors, a middle-aged woman with curlers still in her hair. "I've lived next door to them for almost a year," the neighbor was saying, voice pitched for the camera. "She's always in that fast food uniform, coming and going at all hours. That poor little girl is often alone. I've heard her crying through the walls." The reporter nodded sympathetically, jotting notes. "And did you ever report your concerns?" The neighbor hesitated. "Well, it's not my place to interfere in how people raise their kids. But children need more than minimum wage, don't they?" Margaret frowned as she overheard the conversation, noticing how quickly the narrative was forming. 6 years of nursing in pediatrics had taught her that surface appearances rarely told the complete story. After finishing with Ellie's hair, Margaret brought her a small cup of real apple juice, not the watered-down version usually served to patients. "This is the good kind," she whispered conspiratorially. "I saved it especially for you." Ellie's face lit up with a smile that momentarily erased the strain of her illness. "Thank you, Miss Margaret." As the child sipped her juice, Margaret sat beside her bed. "Ellie, can you tell me a bit about your home? Who takes care of you when your mom is working?" "Mostly just me," Ellie said. "I'm a big girl now. I can make sandwiches and everything. Mrs. Rivera from next door checks on me sometimes, but she works too." She paused, looking down at her cup. "My mommy's trying real hard. She tells me that every night when she tucks me in." The sincerity in the child's voice struck Margaret deeply. Before she could ask another question, Officer Jackson appeared in the doorway. "Nurse Simmons, could I have a word?" In the hallway, Mark's expression was grim. "I've interviewed the mother. Claims she was working a double shift at the fast food place on Main Street. Says she couldn't find a babysitter last minute and couldn't afford to lose the hours." "And you don't believe her?" Margaret asked, noting the skepticism in his tone. "I've called her workplace to verify, but it doesn't excuse leaving a 6-year-old alone, especially one who became seriously ill." He glanced at his notes. "Child Protective Services is sending someone. In the meantime, I need to take a statement from the child." Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "Officer Jackson, that little girl in there is scared and in pain. Whatever questioning you need to do, please remember that." Mark's expression softened slightly. "I've got kids of my own, Nurse Simmons. I'll be gentle." As they re-entered Ellie's room, Margaret noticed a small figure hovering by the nurse's station, a young woman in a fast food uniform watching them with red-rimmed eyes. Karen Thompson's fingers nervously twisted a worn name tag as she whispered to herself, "Too low for anyone but Margaret to hear. Please don't take my baby. Please don't take my baby." In that moment, Margaret saw beyond the rumpled uniform and unwashed hair to something familiar, the desperate love of a mother fighting battles that no one else could see. A tense silence filled Ellie's hospital room when Karen Thompson was finally allowed to enter. She rushed to her daughter's bedside, her fast food uniform wrinkled and her hair hastily pulled back in a ponytail. Officer Jackson stood near the door, watching intently, while Dr. Chen reviewed charts at the foot of the bed. Margaret remained by Ellie's side, observing the reunion with careful eyes. "Ellie, baby," Karen's voice broke as she reached for her daughter's hand. "I'm so sorry. I came as soon as they called the restaurant." "Mommy." Ellie's face brightened, though pain still shadowed her features. "Miss Margaret fixed my hair." Karen's eyes met Margaret's briefly, a flash of gratitude mixed with fear. Margaret noticed how Karen's hands trembled as she stroked Ellie's cheek, how she held her breath whenever someone looked directly at her. The young mother's shoulders were hunched as if permanently braced for judgment. "Mrs. Thompson," Officer Jackson began, his tone professionally detached. "We need to discuss the circumstances that led to your daughter being alone this morning." Karen's fingers tightened around Ellie's small hand. I had to work. The morning shift called out sick, and my manager said, "If I didn't come in," she swallowed hard. "We're already behind on rent. I didn't have a choice." "There are always choices when it comes to child safety," Jackson replied. Margaret noticed Karen wincing as she lowered herself into the chair beside Ellie's bed, the movement careful and measured. The young mother's face was pale beneath her makeup, dark circles prominent under her eyes, not just the exhaustion of a working parent, but something deeper. "Your daughter has a severe infection that could have become life-threatening," Dr. Chen said, her tone clinical but not unkind. "She mentioned you give yourself injections at home?" Karen's head snapped up, eyes widening in alarm. It's prescribed medication. I have papers. Mommy has special medicine because she gets really tired sometimes," Ellie interjected, eager to help explain. "But it's expensive, so sometimes she has to skip days." A heavy silence followed this innocent revelation. Karen closed her eyes briefly, her face a mask of shame and defeat. "Child Protective Services will be here shortly," Officer Jackson said, making a note in his book. "They'll need to conduct a home assessment and determine appropriate next steps." "Please," Karen whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "She's all I have." As Margaret watched this exchange, she noticed how Karen subtly massaged her wrist when she thought no one was looking, the slight swelling of her joints, the careful way she moved. Medical instincts, honed over decades of nursing, stirred in Margaret's mind, pieces of a puzzle slowly shifting into place. "Officer," Margaret said quietly, "I'd like a moment to check on Ellie's medication schedule. Perhaps you and Dr. Chen could step out briefly." When they reluctantly complied, Margaret turned, back to find Karen looking at her with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope, still holding her daughter's hand, as if it might be the last time. The hospital corridor bustled with activity as Sophia Martinez from Child Protective Services made her way to room 317. With a decade of experience, handling cases ranging from minor neglect to severe situations, Sophia maintained a careful balance between compassion and professional distance. Today's case, a 6-year-old girl found alone, seriously ill, had already been flagged as high priority. Inside the room, Ellie was resting, her fever finally responding to treatment. Karen sat beside her, shoulders tense, eyes darting nervously to the door whenever footsteps approached. Margaret had just finished checking Ellie's IV when Sophia entered, case file in hand. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Sophia Martinez from Child Protective Services." Her tone was neutral, neither accusatory nor sympathetic. "I need to speak with you about Ellie's home situation." Karen's face paled, but she nodded, squeezing Ellie's hand before standing. "Can we talk outside? I don't want to upset her." In a small consultation room down the hall, Karen perched on the edge of a chair while Sophia reviewed her notes. Margaret had stepped out to check on other patients, but found herself lingering near the doorway, drawn by something about this case that didn't quite add up. "Mrs. Thompson, where were you when your daughter called 911 this morning?" Sophia began. "At work. I'm a shift supervisor at Friendly's Burger on Main Street." Karen's voice was barely audible. "I had to cover the morning shift. The assistant manager threatened to cut my hours if I refused." "And who was supposed to be watching Ellie?" Karen's gaze dropped to her hands. "Mrs. Rivera from next door usually keeps an eye on her, but she had an early doctor's appointment today. I thought I was going to be home by noon. Ellie knows how to call me at work if she needs anything." "A 6-year-old shouldn't be left alone under any circumstances," Sophia said firmly. "Especially one with health issues." "Health issues?" Karen's confusion seemed genuine. "Ellie's been tired lately, but she hasn't been sick. Not until this morning when I called to check on her and she said her legs hurt." Sophia made notes, her expression revealing nothing. "According to Dr. Chen, Ellie has a severe urinary tract infection that spread to her kidneys. This kind of infection doesn't develop overnight, Mrs. Thompson. Karen's face crumpled. I didn't know. She didn't tell me she was hurting before today. I would have. Her voice broke. From her vantage point near the door, Margaret noticed again how Karen moved gingerly, the slight wince when she shifted in her chair. The nurse's experienced eyes caught other details too. The way Karen's right hand trembled slightly when she reached for the tissue Sophia offered, the rash partially visible beneath her shirt collar. Meanwhile, in Ellie's room, Dr. Chen was reviewing the child's medical records on her tablet. Frowning, she scrolled through past appointments, test results, and medication lists. Something about the pattern troubled her medical intuition. Back in the consultation room, Sophia continued her questioning. Your neighbors report that you're frequently absent, coming and going at unusual hours. I work split shifts, Karen explained, desperation creeping into her voice. Morning shift ends at 2 p.m., and I often pick up evening shifts that go until midnight. It's the only way to make enough for rent and Ellie's after-school program. And weekends? I work those too, every hour I can get. Karen's voice hardened slightly. I'm doing the best I can. Do you know how expensive it is to find reliable childcare? Or what happens when you call in sick too many times on a minimum wage job? Margaret, still listening from the hallway, made a decision. She stepped away quietly, heading not toward her other patients but to the hospital records department. Years of experience told her there was more to Karen Thompson's story than a simple case of neglect, and she intended to find out what it was. As she walked, Margaret thought of the prescription bottles Ellie had mentioned, the injections drawn with surprising accuracy in a child's crayon picture, the swollen joints she'd observed on Karen's hands. 40 years of nursing had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her that the real story of Ellie and Karen Thompson had yet to be uncovered. Margaret sat in her small kitchen the following morning, a cup of tea cooling before her untouched. Outside, dawn was just breaking over Oak Ridge, painting the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold. In 13 days, she would clear out her locker at Memorial Hospital, attend a modest retirement party, and end 40 years of nursing. The thought should have filled her with satisfaction, perhaps even relief after decades of long shifts and emotional labor. Instead, she found herself thinking of a little girl with a one-eared rabbit and the mother who might lose her. You're awfully quiet this morning, her husband Robert remarked, folding his newspaper. Thinking about the Thompson case? Margaret nodded, wrapping her hands around the teacup for warmth. I checked hospital records after my shift yesterday. Karen Thompson has been a patient at Memorial 3 times in the past 2 years, always in the emergency room, never following up with specialists despite referrals. Not unusual for someone working minimum wage jobs, Robert pointed out. No health insurance, no time off for appointments. That's just it, Margaret said, her brow furrowing. She does have insurance, state assistance for Ellie, and a basic plan through her job, but she's stretched so thin between copays and deductibles that she can't afford the treatment she needs. Robert studied his wife's face, recognizing the look she got. When something wasn't sitting right. What aren't you telling me, Maggie? Her symptoms, her medication history. I've seen this pattern before. Margaret sipped her tea, now lukewarm. The swollen joints, extreme fatigue, the rash I noticed on her neck. And Ellie mentioned her mother gets special medicine with needles. You think she has something serious. I think she's hiding something serious, Margaret corrected. And I think that's why she's been working herself to exhaustion and leaving Ellie alone more often than she should. Robert reached across the table to squeeze his wife's hand. You're retiring in less than 2 weeks, Margaret. This isn't your battle to fight. Maybe that's exactly why it is, she replied softly. Maybe the hardest cases find us right when we think we're ready to walk away. After breakfast, instead of heading to the hospital for her shift, Margaret found herself driving to the address listed in Ellie's file. The Thompson apartment was in a weathered complex on the east side of town, where rent was cheaper but conditions were often substandard. In daylight, The peeling blue paint and sagging front steps looked even more forlorn than they had in the paramedics' report. She sat in her car for several minutes questioning her decision. This wasn't her job. Child Protective Services was already involved. The proper channels were being followed. Yet something pulled her toward that broken flower pot and faded door, not just concern for Ellie, but a nagging sense that Karen Thompson was fighting a battle no one had bothered to understand. Margaret thought of her own son years ago, how quickly the school had labeled him a problem child before his learning disability was diagnosed. How differently his story might have ended, without an advocate who looked beyond easy assumptions. With a deep breath, she stepped out of her car, smoothing her civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater instead of scrubs. She wasn't here as Nurse Simmons today. She was here as Margaret, following a hunch that had kept her awake all night. As she approached the apartment, a neighbor emerged from the adjacent unit, an elderly woman with shrewd eyes and a plastic shopping bag in hand. "You with the government?" the woman asked bluntly, eyeing Margaret with suspicion. "No, ma'am. I'm a nurse who treated Ellie at the hospital. I just wanted to check on the family's situation." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Poor little thing. Always so polite when I see her. Not like some of the wild ones around here." She hesitated, then added, "Her mama works too hard. Doesn't ask for help even when she needs it. Do you know when Karen might be home?" Margaret asked. "Not until evening. She's at that burger place all day, then has a cleaning job at the office park after." The woman shook her head. "I've told her she's pushing too hard, especially with her condition, but she won't listen." Margaret's attention sharpened. "Her condition?" The neighbor suddenly looked uncomfortable. "Not my business to tell, but if you're really trying to help, you might want to talk to her boss at Friendly's Burger. He knows more than most about what that girl's going through." With a nod of thanks, Margaret returned to her car, the familiar sense of purpose flowing through her veins. For 40 years, she had been solving human puzzles one piece at a time. Karen and Ellie Thompson were her last case, whether the hospital administration knew it or not. As she drove toward Main Street, Margaret glanced at her watch. Her shift had started 30 minutes ago. For the first time in her dedicated career, Nurse Simmons was officially late for work, and she didn't regret it for a moment. Friendly's Burger hummed with the quiet efficiency of mid-morning preparations. The breakfast rush had ended, and the lunch crowd had yet to arrive, leaving the restaurant in a brief lull of relative calm. Margaret pushed through the glass doors, the smell of fryer oil and coffee enveloping her. Behind the counter, a lanky manager in his 40s was directing a teenage employee on proper sandwich assembly. His name tag read, Steve. "Excuse me," Margaret approached the counter. "I'm looking for information about Karen Thompson. I understand she works here?" Steve's expression immediately became guarded. "Are you from the hospital?" "Karen called in today, first time in months. Said she needed to be with her daughter." "I'm Margaret Simmons, a nurse who's been caring for Ellie. I'm trying to understand their situation better." She hesitated, then added, "This isn't official hospital business. I'm here on my own time." The manager studied her face, seeming to weigh his options. "Look, Karen's our hardest worker. Never complains, never misses a shift. Until yesterday when that call came about Ellie. Whatever they're saying about her being negligent, they don't know her. I'm beginning to think nobody really does." Margaret replied quietly. "How long has she worked here?" "Almost 3 years." Steve lowered voice. "Started part-time when she was still in community college, then went full-time after she had to drop out. Been trying to promote her to assistant manager for a year, but she keeps turning it down." Turning down a promotion? Why would she do that? Steve glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "The medical insurance. Our assistant manager plan has a 3-month waiting period before benefits kick in. She can't go without coverage that long, not with her condition." Margaret's pulse quickened. "What condition, Steve?" He looked uncomfortable. It's not my place to say. Karen's private about it, but I make sure her schedule allows for her treatment days, even though corporate gives me grief about the special accommodation. Does she ever mention lupus? Margaret asked directly, watching his reaction. The flicker in his eyes confirmed her suspicion before he could respond. How did you? Medical training and 40 years of experience, Margaret said. The symptoms are there if you know what to look for. But Karen's been hiding it, hasn't she? Steve nodded reluctantly. She's terrified of people finding out, says the system doesn't look kindly on single mothers. With chronic illnesses. He hesitated, then added, Last month she collapsed in the break room, made me swear not to call an ambulance, said she couldn't afford the bills, but I think she was more afraid of what would happen with Ellie if authorities found out how sick she really is. Margaret's mind raced, pieces falling into place. The frequent absences neighbors reported weren't neglect. They were medical necessity. The injections Ellie had drawn were likely immunosuppressants. Karen wasn't just working herself to exhaustion. She was doing it while battling an autoimmune disease that drained her energy and caused debilitating pain. Thank you, Steve, Margaret said, turning to leave. You've helped more than you know. Wait, he called after her. Are they going to take Ellie away? Karen loves that little girl more than anything. It would destroy her. Margaret paused at the door. Not if I can help it. Her next stop was Karen's apartment. Using the spare key that Officer Jackson had mentioned was kept under the stone turtle, Margaret let herself in. This wasn't strictly legal or ethical, and she knew it, but understanding the full picture had become more important than following protocol. Inside, the apartment told a different story than first impressions suggested. Despite its shabbiness, there were signs of devoted parenting everywhere. Ellie's artwork carefully displayed on the refrigerator, a reading chart with gold stars, neatly organized school supplies. A kitchen calendar was meticulously marked with work shifts, Ellie's school events, and doctor appointments. In the bathroom cabinet, Margaret found what she was looking for: prescription bottles for hydroxychloroquine, prednisone, and a biologic immunosuppressant. Some were nearly empty, others had labels indicating refills had been stretched beyond their intended time frame. On the bedside table, a framed photo showed a healthier Karen holding a toddler Ellie, both smiling broadly. Beside it lay a worn journal. Margaret hesitated, then opened it, knowing she was crossing a line but unable to stop herself. The first entry she read, dated 6 months earlier, made her heart sink. Flare up worse today. Had to choose between refilling my prescriptions and paying Ellie's after-school program. Chose the program. Can't let anyone know I can't handle everything. They'll take her away from me. She's all I have left. The hospital cafeteria was nearly empty when Karen Thompson shuffled in, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She'd spent the night in an uncomfortable chair beside Ellie's bed, rising only to use the bathroom or get her daughter water. Margaret, who had just come on shift, watched from the coffee station as Karen stared blankly at the limited breakfast options. The oatmeal is the least offensive choice, Margaret said, approaching with 2 coffee cups. Though I'd avoid the muffins unless you're partial to cardboard. Karen looked up, startled. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by wariness. You're Ellie's nurse. Margaret, she reminded her, offering one of the coffees. You look like you could use this. After a moment's hesitation, Karen accepted the cup. Thank you. They settled at a corner table, Karen's shoulders hunched defensively, as she sipped the bitter hospital coffee. The cafeteria's fluorescent lights were unforgiving, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes and the pallor beneath her skin. Ellie's responding well to antibiotics, Margaret said. Dr. Chen thinks the infection is finally under control. When can I take her home? Karen asked, her voice small but determined. Margaret studied her face. That depends on several factors. Medical clearance is only part of it. Karen flinched as if struck. You mean Child Protective Services? Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. They're going to take her, aren't they? Instead of answering directly, Margaret asked, How long have you had lupus, Karen? The young mother's head snapped up, eyes wide with shock. How did you— I'm a nurse with 4 decades of experience, Margaret said gently, and I might have visited your apartment yesterday. You had no right, Karen whispered, anger and fear battling in her expression. You're right, I didn't. Margaret's voice remained calm. But I've spent my career watching systems fail the people they're meant to protect. I wasn't about to let that happen again without at least understanding the full picture. Silence stretched between them. In the background, cafeteria workers prepared for the lunch rush, the clatter of trays providing a steady rhythm to the tense conversation. I was diagnosed 3 years ago, Karen finally said, staring into her coffee. Right after Ellie's father left, the doctor said stress can trigger flare-ups, and there's nothing quite like being abandoned with a 3-year-old to stress you out. Her attempt at humor fell flat, voice cracking on the last words. Why hide it? Margaret asked. There are resources, assistance programs. Are there? Karen looked. Unexpected fire in her eyes. Do you know what happens when you admit you have a chronic illness as a single parent? Everyone starts watching, waiting for you to fail. One missed appointment, one bad day when you can't get out of bed, and suddenly you're unable to provide adequate care. I've seen it happen to others. She took a shaky breath. I did everything they told me to. Worked more hours, never asked for handouts, got insurance through my job, stretched my medications when I had to, kept Ellie in school with perfect attendance. But it's never enough. Margaret listened, seeing the impossible choice this young woman faced every day, between seeking treatment and keeping her job, between admitting weakness and maintaining custody of her child. Last month was bad, Karen continued, her voice dropping. A flare-up hit right when rent was due. I had to choose between my biologics and our apartment, the pills I can stretch but you can't negotiate with a landlord. And Ellie, Margaret asked, how much does she understand? A small, sad smile touched Karen's lips. More than a 6-year-old should. She knows mommy gets very tired sometimes and needs special medicine. She's learned to be so independent. Makes her own sandwiches, gets herself dressed if I'm having a bad morning. Pride and guilt mingled in her voice. She shouldn't have to be that grown up yet. But what choice do we have? Margaret reached across the table and did something unprofessional. She took Karen's hand in hers. The younger woman's fingers were slightly swollen, the joints tender. Classic lupus symptoms. What happened the day Ellie called 911? Margaret asked softly. Tears filled Karen's eyes. I thought she was just tired. She'd been moving slower for a few days, but kids get like that, right? No fever, no complaints. I had to work a double shift. We're behind on electric this month. Mrs. Rivera usually watches her, but she had a doctor's appointment. I thought it would be okay for a few hours. She wiped her eyes with a napkin. I called to check on her during my break and she said her legs hurt. I told her I'd be home in an hour, but then her voice broke completely. You're doing the best you can, Margaret said, squeezing her hand gently. But it wasn't enough, was it? Karen whispered, the weight of failure heavy in her voice. And now they're going to take her away. As they sat in the sterile cafeteria, 2 women from different generations bound by an unexpected connection, Margaret made a decision. Her retirement could wait. First, she had a system to fight. Margaret stood her ground in Dr. Chen's office, facing the younger doctor across the desk. Morning light streamed through the blinds, casting stripes across the medical certificates on the wall. I'm not comfortable getting involved in a CPS case, Margaret, Dr. Chen said, frowning at Karen's medical records. Our job is to treat Ellie. The mother's health concerns are separate. They're not separate at all, Margaret insisted. Karen has moderate to severe lupus that she's been hiding because she's terrified of losing custody. She's been sacrificing her own health to keep up appearances. Dr. Chen sighed, removing her glasses. Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that a 6-year-old was left alone and became seriously ill. Rachel, you know as well as I do that systems designed to protect children can sometimes tear families apart unnecessarily. Margaret leaned forward. Before you decide this is beyond your concern, At least, examine Karen yourself. Meanwhile, in Ellie's room, Sofia Martinez from CPS was gently questioning the little girl, while Karen waited anxiously in the hallway. "What happens when your mom gets really tired, Ellie?" Sofia asked. Ellie clutched Hoppy tighter. "I help her. I can make my own breakfast and get dressed by myself." "That's very grown-up of you," Sofia said. "Does it make you sad when your mom can't play with you?" Ellie considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But Mommy reads to me even when she's tired. She does different voices for all the characters." A smile brightened her face. "And when she feels better, we have dance parties in the kitchen." Back in Dr. Chen's office, the doctor had finally agreed to examine Karen. As Margaret watched, Dr. Chen methodically noted the telltale signs of lupus: the butterfly rash across Karen's cheeks and nose, the joint inflammation, the signs of chronic fatigue. "How long have you been stretching your medication?" Dr. Chen asked, her tone now medical rather than accusatory. 3 months, Karen admitted quietly. "The copays kept increasing. I had to choose between full doses and keeping our apartment." Dr. Chen's professional demeanor softened slightly. "That's a choice you should never have had to make." When Sofia returned to the nurse's station, she found Margaret waiting. "That child adores her mother," Sofia said, reviewing her notes. "And her mother has been killing herself trying to be perfect." Margaret replied, "Before you make your recommendation, you need the full picture." Sofia looked up, meeting Margaret's determined gaze. "I'm listening." By evening, an unexpected alliance had formed. Dr. Chen provided medical documentation of Karen's condition and how it had been exacerbated by economic hardship. Margaret offered her perspective as a veteran nurse who had seen the damage of unnecessary family separations. Even Sofia, initially rigid in her assessment, began considering alternatives to removing Ellie from her home. "The system doesn't have to be the enemy," Sofia told Karen as they sat in the small hospital chapel, the only quiet space they could find. "But you need to stop hiding and accept help." "What if accepting help means losing my daughter?" Karen whispered, the question that had haunted her for years finally spoken aloud. The answer came not from Sofia, but from Margaret, who had quietly joined them. "That's why you need people on your side, fighting with you instead of against you." In that moment, something shifted. A bridge of trust, fragile but real, began to form between 3 women from different worlds, united by concern for one small girl, and the mother who loved her more than her own well-being. 3 days after Ellie's hospitalization, Karen's carefully constructed world finally collapsed. She had been dividing her time between brief hospital visits and double shifts, desperate to keep her job while showing CPS she was a devoted mother. The strain of maintaining this impossible balance combined with her untreated lupus proved too much. During a supervised afternoon visit with Ellie, Karen was helping her daughter build a small castle from the plastic blocks a hospital volunteer had brought. Ellie was improving daily, her infection responding to antibiotics, her spirits lifting with each passing hour. "Look, Mommy, it has a drawbridge and everything," Ellie said proudly, demonstrating how the front piece moved up and down. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Karen replied, her voice strangely faint. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus as the room seemed to tilt around her. Margaret, who had stopped by during her break, noticed immediately how Karen's hands trembled, how the color had drained from her face. Before she could intervene, Karen swayed in her chair. "I just need a minute," Karen whispered, then crumpled to the floor beside Ellie's bed. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Dr. Chen was called, nurses rushed in, and Ellie watched in terror as her mother was lifted onto a stretcher and wheeled away. "Mommy!" Ellie cried, trying to climb out of bed despite her still healing body. Margaret gently held her back, heart breaking at the fear in the child's eyes. "Your mom is sick, honey. The doctors are going to help her just like they're helping you." Later that evening, Margaret sat alone in the hospital chapel, the colored light from stained glass windows casting patterns across her worn hands. 40 years of nursing had shown her many tragedies, many broken systems, many families torn apart. But something about Karen and Ellie had pierced her professional armor, leaving her questioning everything. The diagnosis was severe. Karen's lupus had flared dramatically, her kidneys showing signs of damage from prolonged medication interruption. She would need hospitalization, aggressive treatment, and weeks of recovery. Meanwhile, Sofia Martinez had regretfully informed them that with both mother and child requiring intensive medical care, Ellie would be placed in temporary foster care upon discharge. It's protocol, Sofia had explained, genuine sadness in her eyes. Karen has no family locally, and without a stable caregiver, we have no choice. The system was working exactly as designed, following all proper protocols, and in doing so it was about to shatter the very family it claimed to protect. As twilight deepened outside the chapel windows, Margaret made her decision. She would not let bureaucracy destroy what illness and poverty had failed to break. Karen and Ellie's story would not end with separation, not while she still had fight left in her. Rising from the hard wooden pew, Margaret straightened her shoulders and walked out with renewed purpose. Sometimes the hardest battles found you precisely when you thought your fighting days were over, and sometimes that was exactly when you needed to fight the hardest. The next morning, Margaret sat in her car. Outside Grace Community Church, a modest brick building with a weathered steeple and a sign advertising Wednesday night potlucks. She hadn't stepped foot inside a church since Robert's mother's funeral 3 years ago, but desperation had led her here. Taking a deep breath, she walked up the concrete steps and pulled open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the sanctuary was empty except for a slender man with salt and pepper hair, arranging hymnals in the pews. "Pastor Williams?" Margaret called. The man turned, recognition lighting his face. "Margaret Simmons. It's been years." He approached with a warm smile and extended hand. "What brings you to Grace on a Tuesday morning?" "I need help, Robert," Margaret said, using his first name as she had decades ago when they'd worked side by side in the hospital's oncology ward before he'd left medicine for ministry. "Over coffee in his cluttered office," Margaret explained Karen and Ellie's situation. Pastor Williams listened intently, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "So CPS is planning to place Ellie in foster care while Karen recovers," Margaret concluded. "Once families are separated in the system, reunification can take months, even years. Karen's fighting to get well, but losing Ellie might destroy any progress she makes." Pastor Williams leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You know why this case has gotten under your skin, don't you?" Margaret nodded slowly. "My sister. When her husband died, the state deemed her temporarily unfit due to depression. By the time she recovered, her children had been in 3 different foster homes. The system nearly broke them. That was 30 years ago," he reminded her gently. "And yet, here we are watching the same story unfold with different characters." Margaret's voice hardened with conviction. "Robert, I've spent my career working within systems, following protocols, but sometimes the rules hurt the very people they're supposed to protect." Pastor Williams was quiet for a moment, then reached for his phone. "Our church runs a transitional housing program for families in crisis. We have a small apartment above the community center that's currently vacant." He dialed a number. "And I happen to serve on the hospital board with Judge Ellis, who oversees family court cases." Hope flickered in Margaret's chest. "You think we could arrange an alternative to foster care?" "I think," Pastor Williams said as he waited for his call to connect, "that systems are made of people, and people can choose compassion over convenience when given the chance." As Margaret left the church an hour later, a plan was taking shape. Pastor Williams would coordinate with his congregation to provide practical support: meals, transportation, childcare volunteers. The church's transitional apartment could house Karen during recovery, allowing supervised visits with Ellie. But the most crucial piece was still missing. They needed the court to approve this unconventional arrangement, instead of defaulting to the standard foster placement protocol. For that, they would need not just Pastor Williams' influence, but medical testimony, character witnesses, and a detailed care plan that would satisfy both legal requirements and Ellie's needs. As Margaret drove to the hospital to share the news with Karen, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the fierce determination that had first drawn her to nursing, the belief that sometimes fighting for one family could be as important as changing an entire system. For the first time since this ordeal began, Margaret allowed herself to hope, not for a perfect solution, life seldom offered those, but for a chance at justice tempered with mercy, for a mother and daughter who deserved to heal together rather than apart. The county courthouse stood, imposing against the autumn sky, its stone columns and broad steps projecting authority and permanence. Margaret climbed those steps slowly, her heart pounding despite her outward calm. Behind her came Dr. Chen, still skeptical but professional, Pastor Williams in his clerical collar, and Sophia Martinez, who had surprised everyone by agreeing to consider their alternative proposal. Karen had been released from the hospital that morning, still weak, but determined to attend the hearing that would decide her daughter's fate. She clutched a folder containing medical records, work evaluations, and Ellie's school reports, evidence of a mother doing her best despite overwhelming odds. Inside the wood-paneled courtroom, Judge Ellis called the emergency custody hearing to order. Her stern face revealed nothing as she reviewed the case file, occasionally glancing over her reading glasses at the assembled group. "This is an unusual situation," the judge began. "Typically, in cases where a single parent requires extended medical care and no family members are available, temporary foster placement is standard protocol." She focused her gaze on Karen. "However, I understand there's a alternative proposal before the court." Pastor Williams rose first, explaining the transitional housing program and the support network his congregation could provide. Dr. Chen followed with medical testimony about both Karen and Ellie's conditions and treatment plans. When Margaret's turn came, she spoke from the heart. "Your Honor, in 40 years of nursing, I've seen what happens when we prioritize protocol over people. Karen Thompson isn't neglectful. She's a mother who's been working double shifts with an autoimmune disease to avoid asking for help because she feared exactly this situation." The state's attorney, a young man with a crisp suit and carefully arranged files, countered with sobering statistics. "In the past 18 months, 83% of single parents with severe autoimmune diseases temporarily lost custody of their children. These decisions aren't arbitrary, but based on the child's need for consistent care during parental illness." Judge Ellis nodded. "The court's primary concern must always be the child's welfare." "With all due respect," Margaret interjected, earning a sharp look from the judge, "Ellie's welfare is inseparable from her relationship with her mother. Forced separation would create trauma that could take years to heal." The courtroom fell silent. Karen sat rigidly in her chair, knuckles white as she gripped the folder in her lap. Finally, Judge Ellis turned to Sophia. "As the assigned CPS caseworker, what is your recommendation?" Sophia stood, her professional demeanor belying the internal struggle Margaret knew she'd been facing. "Initially, I recommended temporary foster placement following standard protocol." She paused, glancing at Karen. "However, after further investigation and consultation with the proposed support network, I believe the alternative arrangement could serve Ellie's best interests while maintaining family unity." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even approval, crossed the judge's face. "Ms. Thompson, do you have anything to add before I make my decision?" Karen rose shakily, her voice thin but determined. "Your Honor, I made mistakes. I should have asked for help sooner. I was so afraid of losing Ellie that I risked losing her anyway." Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them back. "But everything I did, every double shift, every skipped meal, every time I stretched my medication, was to keep a roof over her head and food on our table. I love my daughter more than anything in this world. Please don't punish her for my pride." Judge Ellis studied Karen for a long moment, then closed the case file. The courtroom held its collective breath as she prepared to announce, Her decision, a ruling that would either keep a family together or tear it apart in the name of protection. Conditional approval. Those two words from Judge Ellis changed everything. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively as she outlined her decision. Ellie would remain in Karen's custody, provided they stayed in the church's transitional housing with daily check-ins from CPS, weekly medical evaluations, and adherence to a detailed support plan. This arrangement will be reviewed in 30 days, Judge Ellis concluded, her stern expression softening slightly. Ms. Thompson, this court is giving you a rare opportunity. Don't waste it. Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. I won't, Your Honor. Thank you. 2 days later, Margaret helped Karen and Ellie settle into the small but clean apartment above the church community center. Church volunteers had transformed the space, with donated furniture, colorful curtains, and a bookshelf filled with children's stories. A handmade quilt covered Ellie's bed, and the refrigerator was stocked with home-cooked meals. I don't know how to thank you, Karen said, sitting carefully on the edge of the sofa, still moving gingerly from her hospital stay. You don't have to, Margaret replied, arranging Karen's medications on the kitchen counter in a daily pill organizer. Just focus on getting better and taking care of this little one. Ellie, now fully recovered from her infection, was exploring every corner of their new, temporary home with the boundless curiosity of childhood. Look, Mommy, there's a park right outside our window. The first weeks brought both progress and setbacks. Karen struggled to accept help after years of fierce independence. Pastor Williams organized a rotation of church members to drive her to medical appointments, bring meals, and help with Ellie after school. Margaret, having postponed her retirement, volunteered to coordinate Karen's medical care. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story, this time with a different angle. Community rallies around mother and daughter in crisis. The same reporter who had initially portrayed Karen as neglectful now wrote about systemic failures that forced working parents to make impossible choices. Slowly, a new rhythm emerged. Karen began proper treatment for her lupus, the consistent medication bringing gradual relief from symptoms that had plagued her for years. Ellie returned to school, thriving under the stability of their new arrangement, though occasionally experiencing nightmares about being separated from her mother. One evening, Margaret arrived with groceries to find Karen sitting at the small kitchen table, papers spread around her. What's all this? Margaret asked, setting down the bags. Karen looked up, a mixture of determination and hope in her eyes. Applications. The hospital has a patient assistance program I never knew about. And Pastor Williams found a non-profit that helps single parents with chronic illnesses. She gestured to a community college brochure. They have online classes I could take while managing my condition. Maybe finish the degree I started before Ellie was born. Margaret felt a surge of pride as she watched Karen, still tired, still healing, but no longer alone in her struggle. The young mother who had been so afraid to ask for help was now actively rebuilding her life, one small step at a time. Outside the window, autumn leaves danced in the breeze, their vibrant colors a reminder that even seasons of letting go could hold unexpected beauty. For Karen and Ellie, a difficult chapter was ending, and a new one, still unwritten but full of possibility, was just beginning. 3 months later, on a crisp Saturday morning, Margaret made her way through the neighborhood park. The trees stood bare against the winter sky, but children still filled the playground. There, laughter rising like music on the cold air. She spotted them immediately, Karen sitting on a bench near the swings, watching as Ellie climbed the jungle gym with newfound confidence. The changes in both mother and daughter were remarkable. Karen had gained healthy weight, color returning to her face. Her lupus was finally under control with proper medication, her movements more fluid than they had been in years. Ellie had blossomed too, her eyes bright with the security of routine and stability. Look who's become a regular mountain climber, Margaret called as she approached the bench. Miss Margaret! Ellie shouted, abandoning her climbing to race toward them. In her excitement, she stumbled on the wood chips covering the playground surface. Before Karen could rise from her seat, Margaret was already there, helping Ellie to her feet. Their eyes met over the child's head, Karen's and Margaret's, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition that drew unexpected laughter from them both. From strangers to allies to something like family, their journey had come full circle. "Careful there, adventurer," Margaret said, brushing wood chips from Ellie's coat. "I was showing my friend Zoe how high I can climb," Ellie explained, pointing to another little girl who waved shyly from the jungle gym. "She comes to our church too." Karen patted the bench beside her, and Margaret sat down, pulling her coat tighter against the chill. They watched as Ellie raced back to her friend, resilient as only children can be. "The court made it official yesterday," Karen said quietly. "Full custody reinstated, with continued community support." Her voice caught slightly. "The judge said our case is being used as a model for other families in similar situations." Margaret nodded, satisfaction warming her despite the cold. "And your health? Better than it's been in years. The new treatment plan is working." Karen's fingers no longer showed the swelling that had been so painful before. "I started online classes last week, medical billing, something I can do from home if I have a flare-up." They sat in companionable silence, watching Ellie navigate the playground with growing assurance. The journey wasn't over. Karen still faced the challenges of single parenthood with a chronic illness, and their support system required ongoing commitment from the community. But the crisis that had nearly torn them apart had instead revealed the strength that had been there all along. "I did the best I could," Karen said suddenly, her breath visible in the winter air. "But sometimes only God knows what's enough. Thank you for seeing that when nobody else would." Margaret reached over and took Karen's hand, a gesture that had once been clinical assessment and was now simply human connection. Sometimes we all need someone to look a little deeper, to see beyond what's visible on the surface. As the winter sun cast long shadows across the playground, Ellie ran back to them, cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. "Can Miss Margaret stay for lunch? I helped make soup." "I wouldn't miss it," Margaret replied, rising from the bench. Together, the three of them walked toward the apartment that had become a true home, no longer just transitional housing, but a place of healing and new beginnings. Behind them, the empty playground stood quiet, waiting for other children, other stories. And somewhere in Oak Ridge, another family faced their own impossible choices, invisible to most who passed them by. But in this moment, for Karen and Ellie Thompson, the simple truth remained. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't doing everything alone, but allowing others to help carry the burden. And sometimes, the most profound healing begins with someone willing to look beyond appearances and ask the questions no one else thought to ask.